The evening was quiet when he called me. His voice was calm, polite, and familiar in a way that made me pause. My father's friend had always been kind to me, sometimes too kind. He spoke with a tone that felt both casual and deliberate, asking if I'd like to come by his house that night. I didn't know what made me say yes. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the strange comfort I felt whenever he looked at me, as if he could see something I hadn't yet understood about myself. When I arrived, the house seemed different than I remembered. It wasn't large, but it carried a warmth that felt personal. Soft light glowed from the lamps, and faint music played somewhere in the background. He greeted me at the door, dressed neatly as always, smiling in that quiet way that didn't quite reach his eyes. For a moment, I thought of my father and wondered if he'd ever imagine me standing here, being welcomed into a space that felt too private to belong to anyone but family. He asked if I wanted tea, and I nodded. As he moved around the kitchen, I noticed how still the house was, how even the ticking of the clock seemed slower. I sat on the couch, running my fingers across the fabric, listening to the sound of cups clinking and the water boiling. He returned, placing a cup in front of me, then sat across, his gaze resting softly on my face. We talked at first about simple things, work, family, nothing that mattered. But with each minute, the silence between our words grew longer, heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. He asked about my life, about things my father never asked. He laughed at my small jokes, but his eyes didn't leave me. I caught myself looking back, unsure what I was searching for. He stood up to adjust the curtains, and I noticed the way his shoulders moved beneath his shirt. When he turned back, he smiled as if he had caught my glance. "You've grown up," he said softly. The words hung in the air longer than they should have. I laughed it off, but my throat was dry. He sat back down, closer this time, the space between us thinner than before. He began telling stories from the past, about my father, about the days when life was simpler. His tone softened as he spoke, his eyes drifting from the memory of friendship to something more reflective. "Your father was always strong," he said, "but you think too much." I smiled awkwardly, unsure what to say, but he continued, "That's not bad. It just means you feel things deeply." I didn't know why, but my chest tightened. Maybe because I'd never heard anyone say that before. Maybe because it was true. I wanted to look away, but something in me stayed still. He leaned back, took a sip of his tea, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The air was warm, and yet I felt cold inside. When he got up again, he dimmed the light and turned off the music. "It's getting late," he said quietly, "you can stay here if you'd like. There's a spare room." His tone was gentle, almost careful, as though he didn't want to frighten me. I nodded, unable to find my voice. He showed me the room, a small, neat space with a bed already made. As I stood in the doorway, he said goodnight and smiled again, that same soft, unreadable smile. I murmured a thank you and watched him walk away, his shadow stretching down the hall. When the door closed, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the faint light slipping through the curtains. My heart was restless. I could still hear his footsteps, still feel the warmth of his voice echoing in the quiet house. There was something unspoken between us, something I didn't yet understand but could feel pressing against the silence. I lay down, trying to sleep, but all I could think about was the way he'd looked at me, as if he knew exactly what I was afraid to admit. The night felt longer than usual. I could hear the faint sound of the ceiling fan spinning above me, slow and steady, like a heartbeat. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face again, the calm in his expression, the warmth in his eyes, the quiet understanding that lingered between us. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but something about that house made it impossible to escape my own thoughts. After what felt like hours, I heard light footsteps outside the door. Then, a soft knock. I froze. Before I could answer, the door opened slightly, and he stood there, half in shadow, wearing a simple t-shirt. "I thought you might still be awake," he said gently. His voice was low, careful, like he didn't want to disturb something fragile in the air. I sat up, unsure what to say. He stepped inside slowly, holding 2 glasses of water. "You didn't drink much earlier," he said with a small smile. I took one, and our fingers brushed for a second. It was nothing and everything at once. That brief touch sent a quiet tremor through me that I couldn't explain. That he sat down on the chair near the bed, the kind of distance that pretends to be safe. For a moment, we said nothing. The air between us was thick with unspoken things. Then he asked, "Do you ever feel like you can't tell anyone what's really going on inside you?" The question cut through me. I didn't answer right away. "Sometimes," I said finally. "Sometimes it feels easier to stay quiet." He nodded, looking at the floor. "That's how I've felt most of my life," he said. There was a weight in his voice, a sadness I hadn't noticed before. "You spend years trying to be what everyone expects, and somewhere along the way, you forget who you are." I watched him as he spoke. His words felt close to something I'd never dared to admit, not even to myself. For the first time, I didn't feel like he was just my father's friend. He felt like someone who saw through me, someone who understood the silent things I carried. That he looked up at me then, and our eyes met. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of questions, fear, and something else we didn't dare name. He stood slowly, walked toward the window, and looked out into the dark street. "It's strange," he said softly, "how the night makes people honest." I didn't move. My throat felt tight. He turned back to me, and there was a flicker of uncertainty in his expression, as if he wanted to say something but didn't know how. Then he came closer, just enough for me to feel his presence. "You remind me of myself when I was your age," he said quietly. His voice was warm, but trembling beneath control. I could feel his hesitation, his conflict. There was a kind of electricity in that space between us, gentle but undeniable. I could hear my own heartbeat, too loud in the still room. He reached out, as if to adjust the blanket on my shoulder, but his hand lingered a moment too long. Our eyes met again, and the world seemed to slow down. Neither of us spoke. The distance between us vanished in that silence, replaced by something heavy, human, and real. He sat beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his arm. I didn't pull away. I didn't know if I should. My mind was full of noise, but my body stayed still, listening to the rhythm of the moment. There was no rush, no clear beginning, only a gradual surrender to whatever had been growing between us for so long. He whispered my name, so softly that it barely reached me. It wasn't a question or a command, it was a confession. In that fragile moment, I could feel everything he wasn't saying, the guilt, the longing, the fear of what would happen if the world ever knew. The room felt weightless. The walls seemed to disappear. All that remained was the sound of breathing, mine, his, and the truth neither of us could hide from anymore. What happened next wasn't loud or sudden. It was quiet, hesitant, almost tender, like the world itself was holding its breath. Nothing about it felt right, but nothing about it felt false either. It was something in between, where loneliness and need found a place to meet, just for one night, under the dim light and the safety of silence. Morning came too quickly. The light slipped through the curtains, pale and gentle, touching everything in the room like it was trying not to wake us. I opened my eyes slowly, unsure where I was for a second, until I felt the quiet stillness of his house again. The air smelled faintly of coffee and something heavier, memory, maybe. He wasn't beside me, but the space he had occupied was still warm. I sat up, my mind slow to catch up with what had happened. It didn't feel like a dream, but it didn't feel entirely real either. I could still hear his voice, soft in the dark, and the silence that had followed afterward. I wanted to feel calm, but instead there was a strange heaviness sitting in my chest. It wasn't regret, not completely, it was the weight of something that couldn't exist beyond that night. That I found him in the kitchen, already dressed, his back to me as he poured coffee into 2 cups. When he turned and saw me, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a mixture of tenderness and unease. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady but quieter than usual. "Morning," I replied, barely above a whisper. He handed me a cup, and for a while, we just stood there, not saying much. The air was filled with the sound of the spoon clinking against porcelain, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the small things people notice when words fail them. Finally, he spoke. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly. "I know you must be confused." I looked at him, unsure what I was supposed to feel. "I'm not angry," I said quietly. "I just don't know what this means." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile people wear when they've already decided to live with their guilt. "Maybe it doesn't have to mean anything," he said. "Sometimes, things happen because two people needed to feel less alone for a moment." The words hit me harder than I expected. There was truth in them, but also sadness. I could see it in his eyes, the realization that whatever happened between us could never fit into the world outside that house. It belonged to the night, to the silence, to the version of ourselves we didn't show anyone else that we sat down at the table. The morning light made everything look softer, almost forgiving. He talked about ordinary things, his work, the weather, a book he was reading. It was his way of restoring normalcy, of closing the distance that had briefly disappeared. I listened, nodding when I could, pretending to follow, but inside, my thoughts were somewhere else. After breakfast, I told him I should go. He didn't stop me. He just nodded and walked me to the door. As I put on my shoes, he said my name again, gently, like he was trying to remember it. "Take care of yourself," he said. I turned to look at him, and for a moment, our eyes met. There was nothing more to say. When I stepped outside, the cold air felt different, sharp, alive, real. I walked down the street, each step pulling me further from the night before but not from what it had left inside me. My heart was still tangled in the memory of his touch, his words, the look that said more than either of us ever could that I knew it wasn't love, not in the way stories describe it. It was something quieter, sadder, an understanding between two people who had crossed a line they could never talk about. Maybe it was affection, or maybe it was just loneliness dressed as something deeper. As the day grew brighter, I kept walking, blending into the noise of the city. No one could see what I carried. On the surface, everything looked normal. But deep down, I knew something in me had changed. I had seen a version of love that didn't belong anywhere, one that would live in silence, tucked away like a secret I'd never tell. That night would stay with me, not as something to be proud of, not even as something to regret, but as something that reminded me how fragile we all are when we're looking for warmth in the wrong places.